We have breaking news that I'm sad to deliver about Senator John McCain. He's been battling brain cancer. His family has just released this statement. Last summer, Senator John McCain shared with Americans the news our family had already known. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive glioblastoma, and the prognosis was serious. In the years since, John has surpassed expectations for his survival, but the progress of the disease and the inexorable advance of age render their verdict. With his usual strength of will, he has now chosen to discontinue medical treatment. Our family is immensely grateful for the support and the kindness of all his caregivers over the last year, and for the continuing outpouring of concern and affection from John's many friends and associates and the many thousands of people who are keeping him in their prayers. God bless and thank you all. With me now is someone who knows John McCain better than most, NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, who covered the senator's 2008 presidential campaign. Kelly, it doesn't really matter where you are on the political spectrum or whether you've been on the same side as John McCain or against him. There are few people who don't have respect for this man's courage of his convictions, not just on the political stage and in his service to the country, but as a real American hero.
And that has been enlarged over the 13 months since his diagnosis was made public, July 19th of 2017, with this very aggressive form of cancer. And for John McCain, this twilight of his life has been an opportunity for him to reflect on his service to his country and for him to hear and receive praise from people across the political spectrum. Among his closest friends, Joe Biden, whose own son succumbed to the same form of cancer. Previously, a dear friend, Ted Kennedy, who also succumbed to the same form of cancer. Senator John McCain is someone I've known for 22 years, first meeting him when he was sort of the candidate's pal on the road for the Bob Dole campaign, and then have covered him for all the years since and have gotten to know his family as well. He is, of course, beloved by his wife, Cindy, who he's been married to since 1980, 7 children, there are grandchildren, and a very broad community of people who have admired him. Of course, he became a public figure as a young man because he was the son of the leading admiral running the Pacific Command during Vietnam, when John McCain was himself an aviator and became a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. And he had the opportunity to be released early, but followed the code and opted to stay in captivity in the order in which those prisoners of war were taken. That defined a lot of his public service, but he would often say to me, Kelly, I've been in public life for decades since then. I have done more things than be a prisoner of war. But it was a formative part of his public persona, and this indicates that he is in the final stages of his illness. It is not a surprise that they would reach a decision where there would be a point of ending treatment. I have been told by people close to him that the cancer itself had actually receded, and this is the ravages of the disease more broadly. Notably, I had been looking forward to his 82nd birthday, which is next week. That also marks 10 years since, as a candidate, he announced Sarah Palin as his running mate when we were covering the campaign in Dayton, Ohio, a decade since his candidacy. In the years since losing that presidential election to Barack Obama, he remained a major national voice on matters of national security, continues to this day as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and the recent passage of the National Defense Authorization Act is named in his honor. John McCain is a friend to many. He is the kind of politician who has always respected reporters, teased us, made fun of us at times, jabbed with us, but was someone who we enjoyed working with and enjoyed covering. Of course, I'm standing in the White House, and it's notable that President Trump has had a long, contentious and critical public commentary about John McCain. That does not have any impact today when his family is releasing this statement and acknowledging that he is choosing to not continue treatment. John McCain is someone who is admired by many, even if not the current President of the United States.
Right, you named
certainly the Vice President has been very supportive, Mike Pence.
You named a particular act that was named after him the other day. The President delivered a speech and didn't actually use John McCain's name at all. But it does seem that the President, who does bring up John McCain or makes reference to him, usually negatively, in some of these speeches, it doesn't seem to hurt or affect John McCain. John McCain is a man of principle. He has been a thorn in the sides of many in his own party and in other parties, but he seems to be governed, at least politically, by a higher calling. He does what he believes is proper, what he believes is just, and what he believes is in the interest of his constituents. And again, he's had political enemies, maybe more than most, but
he's been controversial at times for certain.
He doesn't test the wind. He doesn't go out there and sort of say what would be the politically expedient thing to say.
There have been times when on the issue of immigration, people have said he was politically expedient. When I would challenge him on that, he would say that he, who had often been trying to bring about reform in a broad way, comprehensive reform, and that failed, then also advocated strongly for building the southern border wall. He would say his state has changed, the times have changed, and that he needed to adjust to that. So there have been times where people have said he was not conservative enough, and people would say he was hot-tempered and difficult to work with. At the same time, there are people across the political spectrum who have admired and continue to admire his public service. Also, his sons have served in the military. His son, who bears his name, is still active duty. And the McCain family has done a lot for public service, and certainly, as have others who have gone through this sort of extreme cancer experience, they have tried to be a voice for those who have suffered, as we saw the Kennedy family, the Biden family, many others who are touched by cancer. Yep. This particular virulent form of cancer has been difficult. So it's hard for me to talk about it today because he has been a friend for a long time. It's also important that this is a statement saying he is ending treatment. We don't really know what the state of his prognosis in terms of what comes next, but certainly the family making the statement is very notable, and so we wanted to acknowledge that and certainly wish them well.
And, of course, as a victim of torture, a longtime victim of torture, he was steadfastly against enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, and torture. All right, Kelly, we will, of course, stay very close to this story, and our thoughts are with Senator John McCain. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.